I could see a lot of people saying, "Hey, Andrew, this is that's not America. You know, America. I have a right to my 2 cars, my Smith and Wesson, my pool. You know, get your European ideas out of here." Do you get any pushback, or do you feel like people are ready for a different approach?
I definitely get pushback. I'm the chair of the Affordable Housing Committee, or that it's called the Housing Partnership, that works collaboratively with private developers to build affordable housing in my town. I chair that, and I'm running as a candidate on housing, both because of my personal experience growing up so nomadically, like I mentioned, moving all the time. I never went to the same the school for 2 years in a row until 11th grade, so I know what housing instability is like. But running as a pro-housing candidate in a suburban area is, to many people, kind of a death wish. But I actually am not finding that. I'm finding that when you explain the long-term trends here and what we're facing as a society, they listen. So to your point about like, well, preferences are preferences. Some people will like the space of the suburbs. I'm not taking that away. What I'm saying is we have a demographic shift happening in this country where baby boomers who are retiring have these large homes and they're looking to downsize. And they have few options to downsize into condos or smaller developments. And their kids, like millennials my age, are having fewer children. I have 2 kids, a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, and I was the oldest of 5, right? So not only are millennials having fewer kids than boomers, they're also preferring more walkable, denser communities. So you have this demographic shift happening where boomers want to downsize but don't have any options. Millennials with kids want more walkable space, but they don't have any options, because all that exists, and this is enforced by law, all that exists are large single family lots, and it's illegal to build. That's what I hope people understand. It's not that I'm banning the American dream of the picket fence and the pool and the Smith and Wesson. I'm just saying, let us have the dream of living in a 2 or 3 bedroom apartment that's 1,500, 1,800 square feet. That's a part of a triplex, and it's in a kind of cluster village development. That's illegal in so many communities throughout the United States to even build that way. And there's racism and there's other reasons for that in terms of the history why zoning was written that way. But we have to kind of address this heads on. So to your answer, of course, if your preference is to live in a rural area or to have a 2-acre lot in a large single family home, you are going to have plenty of options in the coming years as boomers downsize. Let other people with different preferences, just let them follow those preferences. But we have this NIMBY mentality, at least in the suburbs, which prevents people from even allowing their neighbors to build denser multifamily housing.
What's your take on, in terms of housing, the mortgage interest rate, interest deduction? You know, I've heard some people argue that this was a policy developed when, everybody had to own their own place, and that was viewed as, part of the American dream. But that it kind of distorts the market, and it encourages people to potentially tie up too much of their worth in one asset. Any thoughts on that, since we're talking about housing?
I am so glad you bring it up, Tom, because it has to go. It is a terrible policy. It's regressive. It exacerbates inequality, and it distorts the housing market. That's my short answer to answer your question. But to elaborate on it, this is what's amazing to me. And this is what I'm going back to my pitch at the beginning. As a pro-growth progressive, what I want to, seek social and economic justice, right? I want to kind of use the power of the state when necessary to have public goods, invest in education and infrastructure, sure. But the pro-growth part of it is that we also need to kind of cultivate industries that are the tax base. We need to, not always have an antagonistic attitude to business. But how does it relate to housing? This notion of being a pro-growth progressive. It's this. So much of the US tax code is regressive, not just in the sense that we don't tax rich people enough. It's not so much that. When you actually look at the amount of taxes the US raises from people at the top of the income spectrum, just the amount we raise, the gross amount, it's actually pretty progressive. I'm not saying we shouldn't have more progressive income taxes, we should. But what makes the US regressive is that it's not that we don't tax rich people enough, it's that we tax them pretty high, and then we give them all these goodies back in the tax code. And the worst goodie we give back, the worst regressive kickback we give to rich people, is the mortgage interest deduction. It is, trillions and trillions of dollars over the last few decades. We're essentially funneling to people who have second homes, vacation homes, who have, $1 million larger homes, because there's no cap to it. There's no limit either in terms of per houses or amount per home. So what it does is it encourages people to take on more debt. It encourages people to, especially wealthier people, to invest more in housing because it's protected by the tax code. And we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars a year that we just waste on this mortgage interest deduction. Plenty of other societies have really robust housing markets without this subsidy that encourages debt. And so that's my elaborate answer to explain pro-growth progressive, is that it's not about raising taxes on rich people. It's about cutting the goodies that the tax code gives rich people already, like these deductions, like the mortgage interest deduction.
So I applaud you for coming out so clearly on that, because I have to believe there are some constituents out there who are saying, whoa, I bought this overpriced house partly because I knew it was being subsidized by the government. If you take away this interest policy, I wouldn't have bought this thing. I would have bought a smaller place, and now I'm screwed. What would you say to them?
I think there are phased ways to do it, phase outs that we can do over even a decade. But the simple math here matters. When you have over $500 billion, being wasted, in my opinion, on the mortgage interest deduction, and you have, a small fraction of that even being invested in affordable housing, it's an injustice. And I think the question for those wealthier folks, or even middle-class folks who think the mortgage interest deduction is critical to their lifestyle, I think this is a ripe issue for moderates and even Republicans to run on, to say, you know what, even if you don't agree with Andrew, who would like to invest it in affordable housing, at least let's take the money that we're wasting on the deduction and cut your taxes, make it revenue neutral. That's a minimum. So to those folks who are worried about, wait a second, I invested in this big house, and now you're not going to give me as much of a kickback in terms of the mortgage interest deduction. The argument is, well, we could lower your marginal tax rates. And that's the starting point in the negotiations. I would actually try to make the argument that we could lower or limit the increase of future taxes by repealing this mortgage interest deduction, but also use some of those funds to invest in affordable housing. So that's the argument I make. And I think there's, again, phased ways to do this that don't disrupt the housing market as is.
Let's talk a little bit about education, since you are in a state that is known for many great educational institutions. One of the things that Andrew Yang was advocating was that maybe we're overprescribing college, and that the traditional kind of progressive platform of more grants for college tuition and more loans may not necessarily result in people acquiring skills that allow them to generate earnings to compensate for the 4 years and all of that debt. He was advocating for more vocational training and kind of other alternatives where people learn different kinds of trades and skills. Any thoughts on education?
For sure. For higher education specifically, I'm a big believer in debt-free higher education, but not a believer in free, zero-cost higher education, at least for 4 years. I think a 2-year guarantee, say in Massachusetts, for anyone, and not just high school seniors, not just people with the GED, anyone, 2 years of either vocational, community college, or 4-year public education for free for 2 years as a starting point. So whether you're going to the UMass Amherst Honors College and you're going to eventually go to, say, Harvard Business School, your first 2 years are free. Or if you're in your mid-50s and you're fired from a manufacturing plant and you want to go back to a vocational trade school for 2 years to get your license in plumbing or be an electrician, what have you, that's free for 2 years. The reason I agree with Andrew in that the whole 4-year college mentality is just overblown, or it's too much of a one-size-fits-all. The reason I agree with that is with Andrew is the same reason I agree with his vision that we're going through the fourth industrial revolution. Even if I think maybe the automation issues are not as severe as he plays them up to be, I agree with him that we don't know what the future holds, and that we need to have a more flexible education system where people can switch careers halfway through, say 20 years, and they are a worker at an auto manufacturing plant, and then they want to switch to be a nurse or a computer programmer even. We need to have the flexibility that the jobs of the future are unknown. And so many of these jobs that we think we should invest in today may be gone, either because of trade or because of automation in the future. And so because of that mentality of the uncertainty in the labor market, I think we can't have this one size fits all of like, yeah, everyone should go to school for 4 years for college and it should be free. Well, I'm just not quite sold on that. I'm really not. And so I think 2 years is a good stepping stone, and it should apply across all types of education at all ages so that we have that flexibility to adapt to the fourth industrial revolution.
Got it. I'm about to ask for audience questions, but before I get to any questions from the folks watching right now, I was curious to ask you about healthcare, because in a lot of ways, Massachusetts was discussed as a blueprint for Obamacare. And obviously, that ACA bill has been sort of modified in recent years. But how is healthcare in the Bay State these days?
So there are pros and cons. So really, the 2006 reform, the Romney Care, the precursor to Obamacare, was an access reform bill. And so what it did was it had the same structure that we later saw in the ACA, where there was an individual mandate and there was a goal towards universal health insurance within the state. And when you look at the share of people uninsured, Massachusetts ranks near the bottom because we have this reform, this access reform, that expanded access, that increased risk pools, that had the state level exchanges, all these precursors. We were the blueprint for Obamacare, but only when it came to access. So I am very proud of Massachusetts that compared to other states, and for example, my mother in Oklahoma didn't have health insurance last year. She's not yet old enough to qualify for Medicare. And so she had to get an MRI. I had to loan her $500 last December. Oklahoma didn't expand the exchanges or didn't have as much access reform as Massachusetts does. And that's a policy failure. So that's a pro in Massachusetts camp. But where's the con? We have among the highest healthcare costs in the country, right? So that 2006 Romney Care was an access reform, and it was smart in some ways. But right now, Mass Health is the kind of state agency that administers all of our health insurance, is 40% of our budget. We have over a $45 billion with a B budget here in Massachusetts at the state level. And 40% of it, over $16 billion of it is just Mass Health. So we have among the highest healthcare cost growth in the country. So the lesson here is not don't do access reform, don't expand health insurance access. I think the lesson is healthcare costs are really tough to tackle at the state level. That because of the kind of multi-state nature of hospital companies, of provider networks, and of the health insurers themselves, that it's really hard to do healthcare cost containment. It's hard to contain the cost of an appendectomy in Massachusetts when the pressure that behind the hospital bill, the surgeon bill, and the health insurer, when the pressure for that appendectomy bill is ballooning across the country. It's ballooning in New York and Connecticut and all the neighboring northeastern states. We can, as a state, only do so much for healthcare cost containment. That's why we really need national healthcare cost containment. And it starts not just with the insurers. That's the first place it starts because, as you know, having living now in Switzerland, it's just a different mentality we have in America with the private health insurance market just unusually expensive, causing U.S. healthcare to be unusually expensive. But my argument is it's not just health insurance companies that are bad. And again, maybe this is me making enemies where I shouldn't, but it's also providers. We also have some of the most expensive providers in the country. So we have to start to address this healthcare cost containment. But unfortunately, I think the most successful reforms are going to come at the national level, because we've tried and we're not having great success, honestly, in Massachusetts.